Hey there, friends. Welcome back to As a Man Thinketh on UNASA TV. Today I wanted to talk about the Maude family again because it was recently brought back up to me, and somebody had sent me an article. Apparently the U.S. Forest Service does not talk to the media about ongoing legal cases unless it's a specific media company. But apparently they had said that they had communicated with the Maudes in the past and tried to work things out civilly before leading to what we see today. And that's actually factually not correct. And I wanted to address a couple of these points because, you know, when you look at the Maudes, this is a family that was supposed to go to court in September. They're going to be going to court next month. So this is a good time to talk about it as well. But this is a family, a ranching family, American farmers who were irrigating land that they had a permit to irrigate on. They had a permit, they had a lease actually for a grazing lease for a lot of this land. And they had been irrigating it with a channel, I don't even know how long, since before the Forest Service existed out there. Real quick, guys, you can support this channel by shopping at UNASA Trading Co. We have Defend the Right to Ranch shirts. We have Defend the Right to Farm shirts. We also have, still on pre-sale, our Defend the Right to Farm leather patch hats. We were going to get those ordered this month with Helene. There have been a few holdups, so you still have a chance to order your hat before we place the final order, which will happen before the end of the month. So just a few days left. And as we get into the cooler season, definitely check out our buffalo wool products. I love these products. I use them all the time in my day-to-day, especially when we're camping and we're out doing things. I could wear the socks for a couple days and they don't get stinky. I know that sounds gross, but when you're hiking and you're camping, sometimes you need something that can last a little while. So check out UNASA Trading Co. Support this channel and support our efforts in sharing information. So let's do a quick recap of this case to get you caught up. So according to the fence post, the fence in question and the management practices the indictment alleges are theft have been in place for generations. The indictment charges both Charles and Heather separately, which means they have to retain separate attorneys, and they could each be sentenced to up to 10 years in prison with a fine of $250,000 each. Okay, so you're looking at a $500,000 fine. So here's the timeline of events. On March 29th, Lunders and the U.S. Forest Service Patrol Captain Jeff Summers appeared at the Maude's home and said they had received a complaint from a hunter that a no trespassing sign was posted on a fence built upon an incorrect boundary adjacent to the Buffalo Gap National Grasslands, and that blocks access to Buffalo Gap. But it would be fairly impossible for a hunter to be able to know where these boundaries are. And in fact, I think it's going to be hard for surveyors to actually know where these boundaries are, because we're going back on land records that date back to 1909, right? 1910, somewhere in that range. So this guy makes this complaint. That's what's sealed. Nobody knows who this hunter is. Nobody can see the hunter's complaint. I think that the USDA, if they're looking into this, needs to do an internal investigation on this complaint. The Maudes removed the sign from the fence, said no trespassing, which was erected sometime prior to the 1950s by another member of the Maude family. And I'm going to get into exactly what was going on there in a minute. The family owned the property since the Maudes purchased the acreage adjacent to the USFS managed Buffalo Gap, part of the Nebraska National Forests and Grasslands in 1910. The existing fence was not moved at any point during the subsequent decades, supposedly. The boundary fence and related inholdings has been accepted by the USDA annually through the certification of acres by the USDA Farm Service Agency every year since the National Grasslands came into existence in 1960. And actually, there has been reporting and surveys on this acreage with water rights dating back to the 1950s, and it's always come back as being compliant. So this is not any new information to the U.S. government, especially the USDA. The department's always been aware of the usage of this land, the irrigation of the land, and in fact, part of their water rights permit runs through the USDA land. So it's impossible in this case for the USDA to come out and say, number one, in their indictment, we don't know when this started, but it happened prior to December 2020. And number two, it's impossible to say that they weren't in agreement with the Maude family over all of these years. It's literally impossible because they have reported and recorded and re-recorded and updated all of these records through all of these years. Now, that doesn't mean that property lines can't be confused. It just means that everybody is aware that this particular portion of land has been irrigated and farmed by this family. And there are portions of this land that have been on USDA property because they had to have a permit going through USDA property. Okay, so this is all information that I'm going to show you in a minute. So that happened on March 29th. On May 1st, about a month later, the Maudes met with USFS District Ranger Julie Wheeler to discuss the boundary discrepancy. So Launders was also present for this meeting, and basically what they agreed to was that they had to do a survey because they weren't in agreement on where the property line was supposed to be. Yeah, and I think that they had reason to not necessarily agree with the Forest Service agent. And the only way, in my perspective, that you could properly mitigate this situation is to have a third-party surveyor, and maybe a couple different surveyors, depending on how large of a discrepancy this is. People who can historically go back on records, who aren't being influenced by either party, to survey this part of land. And then after that, they discussed what the different administrative steps would be to remedy this situation. So this is a very amicable meeting. Hey, okay, so there could be a discrepancy here. In order for us to figure out a solution, we first need to survey it. And when we survey it, we'll be able to figure out what we're going to do next. The Maudes agreed to a survey, but they asked Launders to make sure that he asks permission before bringing survey crews across their property to access this section of land. That's a typical Fourth Amendment right. He doesn't have a warrant to go walking through their land. He could probably enter their land from the other side. I'm not sure which way he came in to survey, but I think there was some offense taken to the standpoint of you need to ask permission to come onto our land with surveyors. He was there 5 days later with surveyors on May 6th. I don't know anything about the surveying crew, but he led the crew, and they completed a survey that nobody's seen, which is a bit odd. You know, nobody saw the survey. He didn't share it with the Maudes, who this property line is in dispute with. The next thing you know, on June 24th, the Maudes are summoned to appear in district court. Now, you haven't heard much about the story since June 24th, and that's because, as I mentioned in my last video, I don't think that a lot of people, you know, with a lot of these large agencies, groups, these politicians who have come out voicing concern over this, I think they were waiting to see evidence. And it took from June 24th until recently for any evidence to be produced to the Maudes as to what was going on. Okay, so at this point, what we have is somebody in the end of March, a hunter, comes out, knows exactly where the property lines are supposed to be, and therefore reports them to the USFS. Launders comes out with another officer. They confront them. They take down the no trespassing sign, you know, say, we're sorry, we, you know, didn't know, whatever. And then in May, one of the district rangers comes out with Launders to sit down and discuss, you know, what's going on with the property line. At that time, they agree. Both parties seem to agree, according to, you know, this report. We don't know the whole side of the USFS because they're pretty tight-lipped about it. But it seems as though a survey needs to be done, and they recognize that it could take some time for a survey to be done. 5 days later, this same agent shows up with a survey crew and surveys it himself. The Maudes aren't present when they do the survey. They never see the survey, and that information's not shared with them. And then roughly a month later, they get indicted. The indictment is a very serious indictment, all over a 75-year-old fence line. According to Edoff, who is a neighbor of Charles and Heather, the Cheyenne River is the boundary of the two lots in question. This is where my information and my opinion of this entire situation changes. Cheyenne River is the fourth boundary of the two lots in question. Part of Maude's property bordering the southern lot in question has been fenced in and managed by the USFS for decades, he says. Charles's great-grandfather had an irrigation ditch for about a mile crossing that property. they allowed him to put that ditch in and irrigate that bottom. They lost so much water through the years to it going into the ground that they started pumping it out of the river, explaining that Charles and Heather updated the watering system from a big run irrigation system to a pivot in 2020. The date the indictment indicates the theft occurred. The permanent components of the pivot are all on private property, with the outermost portion passing over some of the acres in question. So this is where we can narrow down exactly where this is going on. And this is the section along the river where obviously there's some land being irrigated, and, you know, according to the GIS, there are some property line concerns, but I have some concerns about where those lines lie on the GIS. And like I said, these things aren't accurate, so you'd have to go off of old surveys. Some of these surveys are probably pretty dang old, 1910. The Maude family has signed grazing agreements with the Forest Service every year since the Forest Service came into existence. The Forest Service never once told them to cease and desist on how they were using that land. They never have gotten a letter from the Forest Service telling them not to farm it. So the water right is actually, it shows up. This is where things get really confusing. The water right shows up in Section 18 for Charles Maude, but it actually ran north to Section 8. Okay, so here you have the permit down here, Charles K. Maude. If you click on this and you open it up, you'll scroll down and you will find this survey, which I'll come back to in just a second. This channel ran up through here, and then this was Section 8, where the survey was that we'll be going over. This particular survey can be a little confusing for a couple different reasons. Number one, the way in which the river is running has changed, and number two, north is pointing the other direction. So we're going to quickly rotate that, and now I'm going to put this up next to another image of the land. A couple other confusing attributes here is you'll notice that T3S is a perfect square. And here 3S is no longer a perfect square. It's kind of all over the place, with the bottom line actually being down here. Like I said, the river has changed direction. It looks as though the river at one point came out, looped up, and stayed out here back when the survey was being done. And you can tell from looking through here that over the course of 75 years, it looks as though this river ran in multiple locations. And in fact, according to the survey, their ditch was actually run on an old riverbed, a portion of the old riverbed. So going off of this old survey on record and seeing where the actual side of T3S is on the survey, it does appear as though this entire area may actually be part of this original survey. And I'm sure there's some indiscrepancies there that have been brought up in the past or whatever it might be. But the point is that this entire ditch system seems to be much further over than over here, and the river has changed paths several times. I mean, in many ways, it almost looks as though this entire cell is further west than it originally was back when the survey was done. No matter what, it does appear as though the river has changed directions multiple times. Through other mapping services, you can also get the idea that this river has changed around numerous times in the past. Here we are again, and you can see just a multitude of different parcel cutouts, a lot of confusion in the area of question here. So apparently where I think some of the confusion is they had previous communication with the owners of the land, the USDA, but through a different agency. They communicated through the Conservation Resources Department about switching over their water from a ditch irrigation system to a pivot system. Now that pivot system actually ended up irrigating about 50 acres of the USDA land, which the Forest Service then came in and said, you know what, you have stolen our land, we're indicting you, we're going to threaten you with prison time all over this small plus or minus 40-50 acres. Okay, to give you an example of how unfair this is and how much they have overreached in this situation, if you look at the San Juan National Forest, Okay, 1,400 acres of the San Juan National Forest was fenced off by the Free Landholders Group. Now, I'm not going to get into in this video whether or not the United States government should own that much land, but the government owns a large majority of the land across the United States, and a lot of it's managed by the BLM, some of it's managed by the U.S. Forest Service, a lot of it is owned by the USDA, which would be Tom Vilsack as the head guy of all of this. And mind you, Tom Vilsack just paid out a couple $1 billion worth of payments to black farmers for, then this is what I find absolutely ironic, but he paid this out because of discrimination that occurred under the previous Vilsack administration, under the Obama administration. I think it's rather interesting that those payments were actually for discrimination that took period during his previous time in office. But that's a little off subject. But anyway, so this group, the Free Landholders Group, they fenced off 1,400 acres. They actually put barbed wire up around it. They put no trespassing signs on it. And they said, this land is ours. To me, that is stealing property versus the Maude family, which had a lease on the property, was managing the property, and said, hey, if we switch to this irrigation system, we will be conserving on water. Water conservation is actually a pretty big deal when you get out west. But anyway, the freeholders group, basically they peacefully took down the barbed wire, okay, making sure not to damage the barbed wire, and decided they would take it to civil court. This is a disagreement between the free landholders and supposedly they're involved in some wacky church. But this is a disagreement that has gone on for over 6 years. So there have definitely been conversations that have taken place over that period of time with the U.S. Forest Service before they decided to just go out there and fence it off with barbed wire and say nobody can use this property. And it ticked off a lot of farmers and hunters and people and recreational folks who have depended on using that land. And they were the ones who helped take down the barbed wire fences. But nobody's going to jail. Nobody's been indicted over stealing 1,400 acres of land and claiming it as their own. But the U.S. Forest Service wants to send a mother and a father to jail or persecute them because they are watering 40 to 50 acres of their land. So they indicted them for theft. Fencing off 1,400 acres, I guess, to the U.S. Forest Service is not theft. Now, this is nothing against, again, the entire United States Forest Service. And I think I've made that clear in past videos because there are a lot of great people that work for the United States Forest Service. And in the Maude's case, from what I understand, they actually had somebody, a new regional director, had reached out to them after the indictment and said, hey, look, this is ridiculous. We want to sit down and talk about it, see what we could do to work things out. But the Department of Justice basically told them, because at first they were like, no, the Maudes were like, there's no way we're sitting down with one of your guys again. The last time we did that, we got indicted. So they agreed with their attorneys to meet with this particular person. And then the Department of Justice came out and said, no, you're not meeting with those people. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what makes the difference between these groups. A radical group that wants to claim land, fence it off, call it their own, put no trespassing signs up, U.S. Forest Service does nothing. Or you have a family farm, a rancher and his wife, who didn't necessarily fence things off. They were watering the land. They did put up a no trespassing sign, but that's because people were driving through and getting stuck behind their property on U.S. Forest Service land, and it was costing them money every time to get them back out of there. Folks, if you're a hunter, I mean, we should all have access to public property and be able to get in there and do the recreational activities that we want to do. But if you're going to do it in an irresponsible way where it's going to end up costing somebody who lives nearby money and time to get you out every single time, you should be expecting to pay a significant amount of money either to them or to the U.S. Forest Service. Like, pay that fine. Don't bother people who live nearby just because you were a dummy and got stuck. But the point is they put the sign up there because people were getting stuck. And as soon as the Forest Service said something about it and this hunter allegation said something about it, the sign came down and they explained, hey, look, the problem is people keep getting stuck back here. But either way, they never once claimed the property as their own. But they got indicted for theft. Nothing about this changes anything in my perspective, and in anything, them meeting with the USDA's sub-agency to discuss switching over to a pivot system and not necessarily getting the don't, doesn't change the fact that yes, they had communicated in the past. They've been communicating since before the U.S. Forest Service ever existed because they've been leasing that land. They've had a grazing permit on that land. What the only difference between this group and the radical group that fenced off 1,400 acres is that, number one, they're producing food. Number two, they're ranchers, and they're trying to set a precedent that's going to impact every other rancher who has an ancient old border issue with the U.S. Forest Service out there. And that's going to be a lot of people, because I could tell you those old surveying lines don't match up. There are a lot of people who could go to a civil court and argue these things, which is why, ironically, the U.S. Forest Service actually has contingencies and policies put in place that allow land swaps for small acreage sizes like that to help resolve some of the old surveying issues that they may have between the Forest Service and ranchers. But they want to set a precedent. They want to set a precedent that they can come in, they can kick ranchers off their leases, they can kick ranchers off their land, that they can indict ranchers. And with this radical group that went out there and put up barbed wire fencing, they don't have any other motive, so why bother with them? They're just going to take the fencing down very carefully, not to disturb it, and see them in civil court. To me, that's the difference. The difference is you have a family, a husband and wife with children that are working hard every day. They're raising food for our country, they're raising food for their community. Unless people are going to stick up for that particular group, then there are going to be for people who are sticking up for a radical group that wants to fence off 1,400 acres and claim it as their own. Personally, I think the U.S. Forest Service has failed in this instance, and I know that it's coming from the upper leadership. And in reality, from what I have heard, some of that leadership has tried working with the Maudes, but the Department of Justice, which has been weaponized against many people in this country, basically said, no, you're not to talk to them. This is an ongoing case. We're going to prosecute them. So I think it'll be interesting to see what falls out of this as they head to court in November. And hopefully this entire case gets dismissed, because right there you have an agency that has been inconsistent with the way that it is handling situations between people, and watering 40 to 50 acres versus fencing off 1,400 acres is absolutely ridiculous. They didn't even claim it as their own. The other group flat out claimed it as, like, they flat out stole the land. Like in my view, in public's view, they stole land from the U.S. Forest Service, from the U.S. people. The other guys, they didn't steal the land. They've been managing it. They've been maintaining it. And here's the thing is, when we look at the U.S. Forest Service, they're cutting back on the number of people that they can hire because the U.S. is going broke. You know, without having ranchers and farmers with leases and permits to help manage our U.S. lands, we would be looking at a huge bill. So it's a very, very important program. It's a very, very important program to keep underway. We've seen more and more land over the last several years get turned into national monuments or other things to actually stop people from having the ability to graze and help manage that land. But as we know, when you get out to a lot of these areas, you've got to have grazing animals on that land to properly manage the ecosystem. Without that, the ecosystem fails. You see desertification, and the whole thing falls apart. So I'm curious. I wanted to bring attention back to this. People have asked me questions about it, and from what I gather and what I know, the article that had come back out a little while ago really didn't have any new information, and some of the information I thought was misleading information, trying to win back some of, the public opinion before they go to court. But where they absolutely fail is by not maintaining that policy when somebody comes in and flat out steals 1,400 acres. And they did it very blatantly. I mean, they fenced it off and said that it belonged to them. Instead, what they decided to do in that case was go to civil court and work it out. The Maude situation should have gone to civil court. But like I said, this Department of Justice, a lot of these agencies have been weaponized against certain groups of people. And that's what needs to stop. That's what we need to be looking at as we head into November 5th. We need to start looking at what's happening in the world and who's doing it and why. And these agencies have been weaponized in a way that we've never seen before. It's unfair, it's unjust, and you can't have democracy, you can't have a justice system in a society where these agencies are unfairly prosecuting or giving unfair treatments to certain groups of people. It doesn't work. It's going to fall apart. The confidence in the system will fail.